Dobrodošli ponovo. Nastavljamo sa predavanjima i veliko mi je zadovoljstvo i čast što sada imam priliku da najavim prvog stranog predavača kao gosta naših letnjih škola. Claudio Laks Eizerik je predavač koji je počasni član našeg društva i ovo predavanje je izraz njegove podrške kako našem društvu, tako i polaznicima letnje škole u teškim vremenima. Sam je ponudio kako može da nam izađe u susret i da nam pomogne, te smo se odlučili i zamolili ga da nam održi jedno predavanje za letnju školu. Inače, ovo je njegovo treće gostovanje u Beogradu u proteklih 10 godina i svakog puta i široka publika mogla da ga čuje i diskutuje s njim. On je profesor psihijatrije na Univerzitetu Rio Grande do Sul u Brazilu, u Porto Alegre psihoanalitičkom društvu je trening, psihoanalitičar i supervizor, nekadašnji je predsednik Psihoanalitičke federacije Latinske Amerike, a bio je i predsednik Internacionalne psihoanalitičke asocijacije u periodu od 2005. do 2009. Posebna sfera interesovanja su promene životnog ciklusa kao i međusobne povezanosti psihoanalize i kulture, a ovom prilikom mi ćemo čuti njegovo snimljeno predavanje, pošto su nam tako tehničke mogućnosti dozvolile, s tim što kad bude diskusija, nadamo se da ćemo uspeti da napravimo most preko Atlantika i da uključimo našeg predavača uživo u diskusiju, tako da će on moći da vam odgovara na pitanja. Predavanje je prevedeno titlom, to ćete moći da pratite tokom predavanja, a diskusiju ću pokušati ja da konsekutivno prevodim. Tako da izvolite, uživajte, slušajte Claudia Laks Eizerika, Psihoanaliza kao most za razumevanje demagoških lidera našeg vremena.
I am extremely honored and grateful for the invitation to take part at the summer school of the Serbian Psychoanalytic Society, and mainly for your decision to make me your honorary member. In this lecture, I will develop some ideas about several dimensions of power, and then consider how psychoanalysis can help to understand one of the two main viruses of our time. Naturally, not the coronavirus, whose pandemic still remains as a danger, but the other one, also very prevalent, the virus of demagogy, fascism, and authoritarianism, well represented by many of our current leaders. As you know, psychoanalysis has as basic principles the notion that our mind is predominantly unconscious, and that all our current actions, feelings, and thoughts are associated with or derived from previous meaningful experiences, mainly the ones that happened during our childhood. Currently, however, we also see psychoanalysis as a work in progress, in which several new areas were developed and are in constant evolution. For instance, the application of psychoanalytic ideas and insights to understand the current state of affairs of our culture or previous ones, and in which ways it affects psychic identity and psychic suffering. Continuous research and different kinds of studies made it also possible to take advantage of this knowledge to design and develop therapeutic interventions in different settings than the analytic room, our natural habitat, but not the only one anymore. We know that power has found expression in a myriad of ways in different periods in history, or in the main texts that characterize the culture we know today. If we browse through the pages of the Bible, the Quran, Greek tragedies, or Latin texts, the history of Eastern and Western societies, or perhaps the writings of philosophers of distinct sources, or Shakespeare's plays or Freud's works, or through the main form of artistic expression of recent times, the cinema, we will find that power is a theme that is intertwined with the network of human relationships. In the realm of philosophy, for instance, we can remember three reflections which are still relevant and polemical. I refer here to the proposal for a supposedly ideal political social structure advanced by Plato in the Republic, and the study on the desire for power, the fear, the social contract, and the institution of the principle of authority found in Hobbes' Leviathan. The third one is constituted by Foucault's ideas on the mechanisms of power, the existence of multiple powers which have their own technology, mechanisms, and discipline to watch and to punish. It follows that any simplifications of models of power must be questioned. We must consider that there is a hub and a rim, and also that each and every system contains microclimates or micropower. In Foucault's perspective, all power is relational and functions through mutually influencing networks, producing truth, discourses, practices, and even subjectivity. Let's consider some psychoanalytic contributions. In his study on mass psychology, Freud points out to the importance of the bond established with the leader. Freud studied two artificial groups, the army and the church, and he suggested that both share a common illusion, that there is a head, an all-loving leader who loves all members in the group equally. Therefore, the church can see that the bond that unites each individual to Christ, for instance, is also behind the bond that unites individuals to one another. A similar observation can be made with reference to an army, where all soldiers believe they receive the same share of love from their commander. In fact, what other reason could there be for an army or platoon to follow suicidal orders, such as a frontal attack on inexpugnable positions? Freud, however, reminded his readers that there is an essential difference between these groups. In the military, all subordinates place a single person, the same person, in the place of their ego ideal, therefore identifying with each other in their egos. In the religious group, however, the identification is processed through the introjection of the ego ideal, that is, through the formulation, "Take this all of you and eat it. This is my body, which will be given up to you. Take this all from you and drink from it. This is the cup of my blood." Or through the internalization of the qualities, ideas, and or purposes of a god, a prophet, or one of their earthly representatives. Freud refers back to his ideas on the primeval horde and points out that the group leader is still the menacing primeval father that the group desires to be governed by in unrestrained force, and they are thirsty for obedience. This is a very important point. Therefore, the primeval leader is the ideal of the group that replaces the ego ideal with the ego. Panic arises whenever a commander is killed. So panic ensues when there is the loss of a leader for whatever reason, or if suspicions arise about him. In this circumstance, the mutual bonds between the group members are dissolved as the bond with the leader is severed. Recently, Marilia Eisenstein suggested two new interesting concepts. One is submissive dementalization, which describes the submission to a charismatic leader as a traumatic effect and clarifies Freud's description as the regression of the superego in mass psychology. The other one is conformist dementalization, which describes something close to Winnicott's idea of the false self in people with difficulty to oppose anyone or anything. These are people who cannot say no to any authority. If we take a look, for instance, at what happened in Libya or to what happened in Iraq some years ago, we can understand that despite obvious differences, in each of these countries, the fall of a powerful and tyrannical leader produced the state of disintegration or fragmentation of the social structure and the period of internal war, something that possibly still need a long period of rebuilding in order to replace the leader for another central idea, perhaps, hopefully, of a less tyrannical nature. Although the dissolution of a religious group may be more complex, it allows aggressive drives to surface, drives which had been repressed until then in the name of their shared love for the deity. This shows that while every religion claims to be a religion of love, it only offers that love and tolerance to its faithful followers. Towards the others, we see cruelty and intolerance, as we can see from present-day religious fundamentalists, as well in political arena, where sharp ideological differences produce physical violence, cyber attacks, leaking of private information, and the continuous attempt to destroy those perceived as enemies. For instance, by poisoning opponents, as we saw a few weeks ago in Russia. In the still prevailing primitive social structures that exist in several areas of the world, cruelty and murderous actions against other religious groups may also be turned against one of the members of the same group. Mainly, for instance, when a woman is charged with adultery or other sexual or behavioral transgression. The members of the same family or some religious authority are then entitled to perform the most cruel punishments in such a way that a daughter, mother, sister, who was until then an object of love and respect, is then seen as an evil creature and must be, in a way or another, destroyed. We could think that the sinner or possibly acted out the secret inner wishes of the others, and therefore these projected wishes must be a living example for the other potential sinners. So, we can see the position and the role of the leader, the current representative of childhood parents, in holding the members of the group, the masses or the nation together and maintaining their identification both in the hardships of wartime and in times of flourishing peace and prosperity. The power that stems from the leader can be understood as an expression of collective aspirations, the identification with the purposes of his followers, and the encouragement to make sure these devote their best efforts to the common good. If we look at the flow of history, it is not difficult to remember leaders who were able to personify these collective ideals, leading their people in peace and wartime, because they identified with the aspirations of their followers. Churchill, in my view, was a good example of this during the Second World War. Let us now look at some ideas advanced by Winnicott and Bion. In his study, his beautiful study on the meaning of the word democracy, Winnicott stated that the democratic framework offers a degree of stability for the elected rulers. So, as long as the leaders can carry out their functions, people will provide them with a measure of stability, which would not be possible if each and every question had to be decided by direct vote. From an emotional point of view, says Winnicott, in each person's history, we will find a parent-child relationship. Although voters are adults, a residue of this previous relationship remains. A different way of expressing this concept is to say that in a democratic election, voters elect temporary parents, which implies an acknowledgement on their part that they are still, in a way, children, at least to some extent. This situation will only work if the leaders are able to play the adults' game, while voters play the children's game to some extent by entrusting their leaders with mostly adult responsible actions. Bion studied the role of truth and lies in the structuring of the psychic apparatus. Bion's basic concept is that the building of a chain of signifiers, and therefore of our mental apparatus as a whole, demands that this chain should feed on the truth. Lies will destroy this chain of signifiers by producing false knowledge and generate new versions of these, perversions, psychosis, false selves, and even neurotic truth, which are also lies. For Bion, and I quote, the lack of truth leads to a state of starvation, similar to that of hunger. Thus, growth and mental health need the truth, just like the body needs food. Lies work under these circumstances as a means of discharge that denies the reality principle while serving the pleasure principle. In this context, the emotional experience or its distortion constructed anew is based on a lie and is tantamount to a hallucinatory state, which is radically different from a fantasy as an approximation of the truth or an unfolding of this by means of imaginative conjecture, a creative transformation that expands the chain of signifiers. It follows that lies are a denial of the father figure, essential supporting figure in the introduction of the reality principle, and of the inspiring authority, ideal superego, which should not be mistaken for an intimidating authoritarianism, a primitive superego. When the father figure of its representative is the one who provides the lie, it becomes impossible to build up the mental apparatus, to develop the notion of subjectivity and establishment of values, good, bad, right, wrong, and so on. The result is an individual with no self-reference nor ether-reference. The pleasure principle takes over, lies become the rule, social values are lacking, individualistic states that show no consideration for others are the standards. Anything goes, including violence as a form of relationship. Theodor Adorno, in his essays on social psychology and psychoanalysis, examined some aspects of the fascist propaganda, highlighting that it is usually personalized, glorifying action, religion, and patriotism, offering the masses the fulfillment of their desires, and mainly, despite all its misguided logic and fantastic distortions, it is consciously planned and organized. The fascist agitator, says Adorno, is usually an accomplished salesman of his or her psychological defects, aiming at an unconscious identifications with his or her followers. It is typical of fascist demagogue to boast that they were athletic heroes in their youth. The typical fascist leaders are often called hystericals, but the fact is that they act vicariously for their disjointed listeners in doing and saying things that they would like but are unable or dare not to do so. Hitler, says Adorno, was accepted not despite his cheap peculiarities, his false intonation, and his antics, but precisely because of them. Lastly, I would like to highlight his notion that destructiveness and aggressiveness are a psychological foundation of a fascist spirit. Their programs are abstract and vague. Their satisfactions are spurious and illusory because the promise expressed by fascist oratory is nothing more than their own destructiveness. In a very recent book, Stephen Greenblatt studied Shakespeare's tyrants, departing from questions that we can raise also today. How is it possible for a whole country to fall into the hands of a tyrant? Under what circumstances do institutions of a free society prove seemingly deep-rooted and impregnable suddenly prove fragile? Why do large numbers of people knowingly accept being lied to? How does a figure like Richard III or Macbeth or several of our current leaders ascend to a throne or a presidency or prime minister or something like that? Shakespeare plays probe the psychological mechanisms that lead a nation to abandon its ideals and even its self-interest. Why, he asks, in some circumstances, does evidence of mendacity, crudeness, or cruelty serve not as a fatal disadvantage, but as an allure, attracting ardent followers? Why do otherwise proud and self-respecting people submit to the sheer effrontery of the tyrant, his sense that he can get away with saying and doing anything he likes, his spectacular indecency. Shakespeare repeatedly depicted the tragic cost of this submission, the moral corruption, the massive waste of treasure, the loss of life, and the desperate, painful, heroic measures required to return a damaged nation to some modicum of health. Is there, his place asked, any way to stop the slide toward lawless and arbitrary rule before it is too late? Any effective means to prevent the civil catastrophe that tyranny invariably provokes? In depicting the aspiring tyrant's strategy, Shakespeare carefully noted among the landed classes of his time, as in ours, the strong current of contempt for the masses and for democracy as a viable political possibility. Populism may look like an embrace of the have-nots, but in reality it is a form of cynical exploitation. The demagogic leader has no actual interest in bettering the lot of the poor. Surrounded from birth with great wealth or becoming rich as soon as she becomes a leader, his tastes run to extravagant luxury, and he finds nothing appealing in the lives of underclasses. In fact, he despises them, hates the smell of their breath, fears that they carry diseases, and regard them as fickle, stupid, worthless, and expendable, something many of our leaders showed in their attitude facing the COVID-19. According to Greenblatt, Shakespeare believed that the tyrants and their minions would ultimately fail, brought down by their own viciousness and by a popular spirit of humanity that could be suppressed but never completely extinguished. The best chance for the recovery of collective decency lay, he thought, in the political action of ordinary people. After all, as we can read in Coriolanus, what is the city but the people? The process of development of subjectivity needs ideally optimum or at least reasonable or adequate internal and external conditions. When open social structures are lacking, significant damage may occur. Analytic treatment of victims of the Holocaust and similar expressions of genocide, dictatorships, terrorism, situations of abuse or other manifestations of violence demonstrate how these traumatic events are psychically integrated and represented. Often there is unresolved mourning and the inability to symbolize. These deficits in mental processes can be and often are passed on across the generations, only to re-emerge in subsequent later generations. An important distinction has been demonstrated between intergenerational and transgenerational psychic transmission. Intergenerational transmission refers to the conscious transmission of mental content and processes, such as identifications and fantasies, which are organized into family history and inherited by the next generation, resulting in a structuring effect on the mind. For the other hand, transgenerational transmission occurs unconsciously and is transmitted to future generations. It involves mental contents that are dissociated and not symbolized through words or stories. Thus, primitive and non-integrated effects resulting from trauma, pain, humiliation, and loss are not worked through and not mastered. This kind of transmission remains encapsulated and acts as a violent intrusion into the individual's sense of self, as well as being transmitted to future generations. When lies and misdemeanor are perceived as sanctioned social values within a culture, for instance, the different forms of prejudice manifested through racism, a lack or absence of respect for minorities, like homophobia for women, the elderly, migrants, this can produce transgenerational transmission. When it is the father figure in the role of a leader, president, prime minister, autocratic ruler, like a czar, an emperor, a king, or a prince, or some form of current-day representative of these roles, who provides the lie and stimulates violence, denial of reality, for instance, in refusing to acknowledge the alarming environmental deterioration and crime, it becomes impossible to develop a mental apparatus and the notion of subjectivity and to establish proper social values. The current situation in the world, with areas dominated by grinding poverty, famine, ethnic wars, religious fundamentalism, urban violence, and other similar situations, produce trauma and violence, which can only contribute to the transmission of more hatred and violence to future generations. In my view, after a period of reasonable stability after the Second World War, when Western countries, for instance, experienced economic growth and higher standards and quality of life, we are witnessing nowadays in many countries that enjoy democratic values and predominant respect for human rights, a re-emergence of past expressions of xenophobia, violence, and corruption. Several current leaders of these countries are smaller versions of the evil leaders that threatened the world and were key characters in the two great wars of the past centuries. Despite their narrow-mindedness, or because of this, the current ones are so dangerous as their models, and like those, many times pictured as ridiculous characters, like Chaplin did in the movie The Great Dictator. Current ones are as ridiculous as perfectly able to drive masses of followers thirsty for obedience, as Shakespeare and Freud showed us, to all sorts of violence and folly. Adorno's description of fascist leaders and Grimblatt's study of Shakespeare tyrants are extremely useful for the understanding of these leaders that currently occupy power position in different countries, irrespective of the fact that they consider themselves or are considered as expressions of the right or the left or intermediate variations in the political spectrum. In a recent paper a few months ago, examining the dangers to democracy in Brazil, I mentioned some similarities of the current political scenario to what was masterfully shown in Ingmar Bergman's movie, The Serpent's Egg. Well, coming back to Bion, by definition and by tradition of all scientific fields, the psychoanalytical movement is committed to the truth in its very essence. Psychic suffering can be experienced both by leaders and followers, and in the words of some of the authors I mentioned before, a democratic structure must be based on a kind of game in which old childhood relationships are lived over, and in which those roles are assigned and played with the possible predominance of truth over lies and trust over suspicion. The jobs and responsibilities assigned to leaders and to the group of people who are bestowed with authority are to coordinate, lead, and manage the common good. The natural corollary of this psychic investment is that a series of principles must be followed by these servants of the collectivity. What happens when the conduct of the leader becomes erratic, deviant, and unreliable? What happens when lies become current currency? The shamelessness, the mockery, the ridicule take over the court and the media. The panic which Freud spoke of when he referred to a group without a leader or leaders may give rise to different defenses, which may be paranoid, depressive, manic, or confusional. An inclination towards humor, the national trait of many nations, and I think that mine and yours share this. Many nations that experience difficult situations may be very useful, but also may hide a more perverse aspect, a denial of that which everyone knows and is aware of, but which they need to pretend not to know in order to live in society. This is something that Julia Kristeva characterized as the motivation of postmodern men when looking for analysis. He needs to be helped in what he wants to tell us, because he can no longer stand nor speaking and not being understood. Like the prophets in the Old Testament, who denounced the wrongdoings of those in power at the time, or the woman that walked along the Caesars in their triumphal march to remind them of their human condition as mortals, we have today a mostly combative press. If we follow the articles, editorials, TVs, programs, news of several sensible journalists, a concern with the deleterious effect of lying as a matter of practice is constantly criticized. How can we deal with the practice of lying and its seductive alluring networks and ploys in the microphysics of each minute power? Psychoanalysis, as we learned it from Freud and his creative followers, including our contemporary authors, of whom I mentioned only a few, has never ceased to be an essentially subversive field, in the sense that it denounces appearances that pose as realities, the fantasy that wants to oust the facts, the hypocrisy that wants to take over from a painful and much needed truth. Therefore, what we must consider is that leaders who serve as lies as psychic nourishment, who think they can mystify instead of expressing and exerting their responsibility, are in fact contributing to the erosion of the social fabric. They are sowing the seeds of disappointment, spreading disappointments, showing nothing but callousness for the others and the lack of respect for the limits required for life in society. What is our everyday task as analysts? But the quest for the truth, the possible truth, no matter how provisional, fragmentary, frail, and insecure this truth may be, and who can deprive us of the hope that free thinking, independent, critical, will prevail in the end, and that a way of living together based on provisional, possible truth is in fact possible. Just like families and communities, nations also cherish their myths and their heroes. These are often nothing but a common individual who perform small acts, brave or daring in the eyes of their contemporaries, and which over time acquired mythical proportions. We psychoanalysts gather together, we revise and pay homage to our myths and our heroes, some of whom I mentioned here. We do this to illuminate our reality and present day's difficulties, clinical, theoretical, or related to our insertion in the culture. All these psychoanalytic thinkers and some other far-reaching thinkers, for instance, Hannah Arendt, offer reflections that may illuminate us and encourage us to follow a path beyond lies, a path that leads to fragmented, partial, provisional truth, which need to feed our mind and our souls as psychoanalysts and citizens. Informed by psychoanalytic knowledge, we know that establishing ways of reducing social division and the projection of hatred are important mechanisms for social cohesion. This requires finding ways to implement the difficult task of listening to others, be it the stranger or even the enemy. But we know that Freud showed how this stranger is in fact someone who represents a hidden or one unwanted part of ourselves. From a psychoanalytic perspective, we understand the need to produce and play new sounds, the sounds that can be heard when collaborative efforts put together different people with differing values and prejudices in order to build tolerance and new ways of working together. The psychoanalytic contribution to build new bridges in our culture occurs in three ways. First, by treating patients whose psychic transformation will also produce some possible transformation in themselves and in subsequent generations. Second, as a tool to increase our understanding of this complex phenomenon. And third, by taking part in joint activities or initiatives where we can show how much open listening can correct distorted perceptions and increase the ability to tolerate and identify with others. The IPA has several committees that deal with all these dimensions and currently had developed many of them concerning psychoanalysis in the community, but we also have a United Nations Committee on Children and Adolescents, on old age, on psychoanalysis and women, and so on. Despite so many differences concerning our culture and our languages, we all share the unique experience of working with words. Words are our mutual, powerful weapon. Brazilian poet Carlos Drummond de Andrade once wrote in a poem, I quote, "Come closer and stare at the words. Each one has 1,000 secret faces hidden under the neutral one, and asks, without caring about the poor or terrible answer you are supposed to give, have you brought the key?" End quote. The psychoanalytic key was used to open many doors, but there are still 1,000 others waiting for us to understand our uncertain, unpredictable, and at the same time fascinating world.